Good evening. My name is Jason Jacobs, and this evening I'd like to talk to you about British Loyalists in North America. Daniel Leonard, Samuel Seabury, Jonathan Odell, and Joseph Galloway. Which of these names sticks out in your recollection of Revolutionary War readings? One could postulate that unless searched for, you may never have heard of any of them but Joseph Galloway, who was a member of the First Continental Congress. As a whole, there's no consensus on how many Loyalists there were. The historian Robert Middlecoff assumes a fifth of the population of the colonies, while some contemporaries of the Revolution estimate that number higher at one-third. Years after the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, John Adams and Thomas McKean, the second President of the United States and Chief Justice of Pennsylvania respectively, both considered a full third of the population to be in opposition to rebellion and separation from the empire. The old adage goes that history was written by those who win. In this case, the names above are a short list of Loyalist writers who were labeled Tories as a group by the political faction that won the contest over independence in North America. Moses Coit Tyler provides an excellent glimpse at Loyalist positions in his article from 1914 written for the New York State Historical Association. One of his major early points in the article is that historians need to see where the people came from in order to understand their position as Loyalists. So what would possess any American to stand against patriotism and for continued British tyranny in the colonies? An answer to this question can be found in the nature of the relationship that had been developing between Britain and its North American colonies during the 18th century. Prior to the 7 Years' War, which is also known as the French and Indian War here in America, the population of the American colonies saw themselves as British in name, but not necessarily in spirit. After the mutual conflict of the fighting against France and her native allies, the development of an imperial patriotism was solidified in the collective understanding of the colonial participants and would drive an Anglican spirit in the future political realm. John M. Murren develops this idea of patriotism to the British Empire in the years of 1739 to 1763. In an essay titled The Dilemma of National Identity, Murren highlights that colonists saw themselves as, quote, self-conscious nationalists, end quote, that belonged to a nation and an empire that were in fact British. Murren's most powerful statement in this regard is that loyalty to the colony was equal to loyalty to Britain. Through Murren's analysis of our identity as a nation, we can see the beginnings of the foundation for a position that supports loyalty to the mother country in opposition to those who are advocating separation from the source of their citizenship or rights. John Butler provides background and context to the continuing development of an ideological separation leading up to the Revolution in his book, Becoming America, The Revolution Before 1776. In the section of the book that's devoted to politics, Butler really brings to the forefront the idea that the close association with British regulars was a catalyst that created a disjointed picture between what colonists perceived as being British and what they witnessed from these British regulars as actually being British. Those citizens that would become the radicals, or those that we know as patriots, would be sparked in their opinions by this schism of perception versus reality, and would set up the beginning of the Tory versus Whig debates, which is, in essence, the Loyalist versus Patriot debate. Through the decade or so following the end of the 7 Years' War, this schism would continue to grow through the political decisions of Parliament and through the increase of colonial cooperation. Butler's assertions fall into the category that loyalists are not a factor in the political discourse of the time, and in fact, this is in keeping with the ideas of Tyler's article in that loyalists were not particularly active prior to 1774. The reason for this may be found in the description of where loyalties resided from Robert Middlecoff. In what is considered by some as the definitive history of the American Revolution, The Glorious Cause, his book, The Glorious Cause, postulates that loyalty prior to 1775 was to the crown. This would have been established through the same chain as in the Murin essay on identity. Loyalty to the colony was the same as loyalty to the empire. And Middlekauff, as we stated earlier, claims that a full fifth of colonists remained loyal to the empire through tradition. In Tyler's article, he presents one of the key difficulties in establishing who this 1/5 or 1/3 list of loyalists was. No one was sitting down and conducting a census to provide data or taking polls with their affiliation with a particular ideology. The 1/5 that Middlekauff espouses is, as a result, particularly difficult to prove or disprove, as is the 1/3 from John Adams and Thomas McKean. One aspect of deciding who this percentage of the population is can be found in a statement that's been attributed to George Washington. He said, "Many people may not have had a preference for either ideology and may have simply just been waiting to see where the balance of power would fall." Middlekauff further postulates that the major weakness of loyalists throughout the colonies was couched in the fact that they were from minority groups. Quakers, Highland Scotsmen, and Iroquois natives were among the different, disparate, and separate groups that held to the old connections of loyalty rather than risk a connection with the new and radical opinion of separation and independence. Not only were these groups small in nature, but as Middlekauff points out, the groups that made up the Loyalists were also removed from any real power in almost every colony. Individual Loyalists, such as Joseph Galloway, were initially not as removed from these centers of power. As mentioned before, Galloway was a delegate of the First Continental Congress and had even established and tabled a plan of union that was only narrowly voted out of discussion at this Continental Congress. His plan was supported by Edward Rutledge and John Jay, among a few others, and provided a method for non-coercive reconciliation with Britain and Parliament. Edward Rutledge, who was from South Carolina, was one of the moderates in Congress, but at that point in time would have had Tory leanings and could have been considered a loyalist based on his support of Joseph Galloway's plan. Joseph Galloway's perspective was consistently one in which he maintained the traditional connection to Britain and he himself was a driving force in seeking royal governance in Pennsylvania. In a letter to Benjamin Franklin, as quoted by Ernest Baldwin, Galloway reflects his political ideology and that he lamented the established government in Pennsylvania that was making, quote, loyalty and affection to the sovereign criminal, end quote. The fervor and description with which Joseph Galloway fought for royal governance and believed in non-coercive reconciliation with Britain was a trademark of his loyalty to and affection for the old connections that Middlekauff was speaking about. Joseph Galloway, who was undoubtedly the most outspoken and visual Tory after the First Continental Congress, did not entirely disappear from the revolutionary conflict. He served openly with the British during the occupation of Philadelphia in a position that amounted to the mayor of the city. But once this footnote as the mayor of Philadelphia during the occupation goes away, Joseph Galloway and other loyalists, there's little effort of their continued efforts in the defense of Britain and their position in the political circles of the American colonies. Indeed, the conservative position that these loyalists occupied in the circles of American politics was vacated quickly by them after the beginning of hostilities and was soon filled with those colonial politicians who were in the moderate category and eventually became the anti-federalists. One of the interesting notions in regard to the reason loyalists were rarely referenced or heard from in the 13 colonies after the initiation of hostilities is that those who were openly opposed to American independence and rebellion may have simply packed up and left. As evidenced by a petition of 1778, which was sent to the Honorable Lord George Germain, who was the Secretary of State for the American Department, provided a list of loyalists who were in Great Britain and recently removed from the colonies. Interestingly enough, this list included Joseph Galloway. There's also evidence that many colonists who had a loyalist bent simply moved to other colonies that were not involved in the dispute with the mother country. Not everybody could afford a passage back to England to return to Great Britain. Wilbert Siebert, in an article, develops a picture of the migration of these loyalists between 1776 and 1777 to West Florida, and highlights that after this there were regular arrivals throughout the early days of the Revolutionary conflict. It stands to reason that if people were willing to move all the way from New England, who he references specifically arriving in Western Florida, there's no doubt that they would have simply moved a little bit farther north to Canada, into the region that was definitely under British control. Many of the reasons we see no continued writing or development of the Loyalist cause in the discourse of politics or history are due to the fact that few, if any, Loyalists were willing or available to provide a contrasting opinion to the prevailing wisdom of the Patriot cause. As room for dissent and peaceful reconciliation shrank, the Loyalists became more likely to move towards areas that were not involved in the Revolution or operated with the British that arrived in the colonies to contain the rising confrontation. They also became less likely to portray their opinion and to bring those things out for fear of prosecution, and they were just letting things go the way they were. It's important to understand that the old adage that we mentioned in the beginning, that where history is written by those who win, is a clear deciding factor in why we don't hear more about loyalists who were loyal to Britain in the discourse of political conversation when it comes to the American colonies and the Revolutionary War.